Mark Lawrence had never been one for theatrics, nor did he seek recognition from anyone in his quiet, well-kept neighborhood. At 58, he had lived a life built on discipline and routine, a habit formed over decades. As a structural engineer, he valued reasoning, practical solutions, and a sense of personal space that others often mistook for aloofness. He wasn't unfriendly, but he wasn't particularly social either. He didn't have long discussions with his neighbors. He never attended community gatherings. And he certainly didn't involve himself in the minor conflicts that seemed to consume the people around him. His home was his refuge, and he had earned the right to enjoy it in peace after undergoing major heart surgery 2 months prior. His focus had shifted almost entirely to healing. His doctor had been clear. His body was still adapting, and he needed to be careful. His condition wasn't severe, but he couldn't afford unnecessary pressure or sudden shocks to his system. He had taken the advice, seriously organizing his life around routine evaluations, prescribed medicine, and maintaining a steady environment. What he hadn't anticipated was the one factor outside his control: the unpredictable and often ridiculous behavior of those who lived around him. Karen Willis, his next-door neighbor, was a woman he had interacted with fewer than 10 times in the past 5 years. Yet he knew exactly what kind of person she was. Everyone did. She had a reputation that extended far beyond their street. An aging widow with a controlling personality, a sharp tongue, and an unshakable belief that the world should function according to her rules. She had been married to a former police officer, something she mentioned often as though it gave her power over everyone else. The way she carried herself, the way she spoke to people, the way she observed every minor deviation from the neighborhood's unspoken standards, it all made her impossible to ignore. Despite his best efforts to remain distant, Mark had his fair share of minor encounters with her over the years. Once she had knocked on his door to complain that his outdoor lights were too bright and were disturbing her sleep, though they were well within the allowed limits. Another time she had indirectly asked if he was aware that the leaves from his tree had fallen into her yard, as if he had personally commanded them to do so. But the worst incident had been when she had reported his truck as an unpleasant sight to the community board, insisting that it lowered property values. He had received an official letter stating that some neighbors had raised concerns, though everyone knew it was just her. These annoyances were at best minor disturbances. Mark had never allowed her to get under his skin. He didn't respond to her complaints, didn't encourage her attempts to start arguments, and certainly didn't seek retaliation the way some of the other residents had. Some neighbors had fought back. One had intentionally mowed their lawn at 6 o'clock in the morning, just to irritate her, while another had spread gossip that she stole mail. Mark, however, preferred to ignore her. It wasn't worth the effort. But that night, ignoring Karen Willis would no longer be an option. It started with the sharp throbbing pain in his chest that jolted him awake. At first, he thought it was nothing more than an awkward sleeping position, but as he tried to sit up, a wave of lightheadedness washed over him. His hands felt chilly, his vision blurred for a moment, and an overwhelming tightness gripped his chest. Like a clamp. He had experienced minor uneasiness before. His doctors had warned him about occasional abnormalities in his recovery. But this was different. This was something far worse. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, but his fingers felt unsteady, clumsy. His breath was shallow, and each inhale felt inadequate, as though he wasn't getting enough oxygen. Panic started to creep into the edges of his mind. His doctor had specifically told him what to look out for: persistent chest pain, shortness of breath, dizziness, cold sweats. All of it was happening now. He couldn't ignore it. With what little strength he had, he managed to unlock his phone and tap the emergency call button. The dispatcher's voice sounded distant, but he could make out her words. She asked him to confirm his symptoms, his address, his condition. He forced himself to answer, though each word felt heavier than the last. She assured him that an ambulance was already on the way, then instructed him to unlock his front door so the paramedics wouldn't have to waste time forcing entry. The effort to stand was almost unbearable. His knees nearly collapsed beneath him, and for a terrifying moment he thought he might fall before even making it to the door. He steadied himself against the wall, took slow controlled breaths, and forced his body forward step by painful step. By the time he reached the entrance, he could hear the distant wail of sirens approaching. He turned the lock, barely managing to twist the knob before stumbling backward and sinking onto the couch. The red and white flashes of the ambulance lights filled the street as the vehicle pulled up in front of his home. The paramedics wasted no time. They were out of the vehicle within seconds, carrying equipment as they rushed toward his door. But before they could even reach the entrance, another sound cut through the night. A woman's voice, loud, furious. Mark barely registered the words at first, his mind clouded by pain and exhaustion. But as the shouting continued, it became impossible to ignore. "Move your damn truck. I can't even get out of my own driveway." Karen. Of course, it was Karen. One of the paramedics turned briefly, thinking it was someone concerned about the emergency, but quickly realized it was anything but that. Karen stood on her porch in her nightgown, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression twisted in annoyance rather than worry. "This is absurd," she continued, her voice cutting through the night like nails on a chalkboard. "You can't just block people in like this. What if I had an emergency?" One of the paramedics, a man in his mid-30s with a professional but firm attitude, glanced at her before responding. "Ma, am we responding to a medical crisis? We'll only be here for a short time," Karen scoffed, shaking her head. "That's not the issue. You can't just park wherever you want. I pay good money to live here, and I won't have some government vehicle taking up space in front of my house." The medic didn't argue further, turning his attention back to the situation at hand. But Karen wasn't finished. As the other paramedic entered the house, the first one jogged back to the ambulance to grab additional equipment. It was then that he heard it, the unmistakable sound of something hard hitting the side of the vehicle. A second later, another strike. By the time he turned around, he saw Karen gripping a large flashlight in one hand, its heavy metal body now smeared with streaks of chipped paint from where she had hit the ambulance. Her face was a mask of unapologetic rage, as though she had every right to do what she had just. The paramedic's shock was obvious, but before he could react, she turned sharply and marched back toward her house, muttering under her breath. Inside, Mark was barely conscious, unaware that while his body was struggling to keep him alive outside, his unhinged neighbor had just escalated something far beyond the scope of mere irritation. The paramedic stood frozen for a moment, staring at the damage Karen had just caused on the ambulance, the fresh marks on the side panel, the dented metalware she had slammed her flashlight. The faint but deliberate hostility in her actions had all painted a picture that was as ridiculous as it was infuriating. He had encountered difficult bystanders before, people who were anxious, emotional, or simply overwhelmed by an emergency situation. But this was different. This was someone who had no regard for anything beyond her own personal world of control, but someone who saw a man's life hanging in the balance and still decided that her own discomfort was the more urgent matter. His instinct was to confront her, to demand an explanation, to let her know in no uncertain terms that what she had done was illegal. But there was no time for that now. Mark Lawrence was inside, barely holding on, and that was the priority. He took a deep breath, forced himself to push down his frustration, and turned back to the task at hand. His partner had already hooked Mark up to an oxygen mask, running tests and preparing him for transport. The signs were troubling. His blood pressure was dangerously low, his skin was damp, and his heart rate was unstable. It was clear that he needed to be stabilized as soon as possible. "Let's move," the paramedic said, his voice firm and professional, though his hands still trembled slightly from the anger simmering beneath his skin. Mark was barely conscious as they lifted him onto the stretcher, his eyelids flickering as he struggled to stay aware of what was happening. He felt hands gripping him firmly, but carefully, voices murmuring things he couldn't quite understand. The world around him was fading in and out, a scattered series of images, flashing red lights, the dim outline of his living room, the shadowy figure of someone standing near the doorway. He couldn't tell if it was real or if his oxygen-deprived brain was simply filling in the gaps. As they maneuvered the stretcher toward the ambulance, Karen reappeared, standing at the edge of her driveway with her arms still crossed, watching the scene unfold with an expression that was equal parts irritation and self-righteous arrogance. The sheer nerve of her presence, the way she made no attempt to hide the fact that she was judging the situation, made the paramedics' blood boil. "Is this really necessary?" she muttered, just loud enough for them to hear. "I mean, he's awake, isn't he? You don't need to make such a spectacle out of it." The paramedic ignored her, focusing on securing Mark into the vehicle, making sure the four-line was in place, ensuring that every precaution was taken. His partner was already calling the hospital, giving them a summary of Mark's condition, relaying critical information to the emergency room staff so they would be ready upon arrival. Every second mattered, but Karen wouldn't let it go. "Are you at least going to move that thing when you leave? Because I swear to God, if I have to wake up tomorrow morning and see marks on my pavement." The paramedic finally snapped. He turned his head just slightly, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt, and leveled her with a look so cold it could have frozen her in place. "Lady, shut the hell up," he said, his voice low, controlled, but filled with rage. Karen's mouth opened slightly, her face twisting into an expression of pure disbelief, as if she had just been slapped across the face. "Excuse me," she gasped. The paramedic didn't respond. He didn't have time for this, and he certainly didn't have the tolerance. Instead, he climbed into the ambulance, slamming the door shut behind him. The ride to the hospital was tense. Not because of Mark. He was stable for now, thanks to the fluids and oxygen, but because the paramedic couldn't stop replaying what had just occurred in his mind. He had been in this line of work for over a decade. He had seen people at their most helpless, their most frightened, their most desperate, but he had never seen someone so deliberately cruel, so blatantly indifferent to human life. By the time they arrived at the hospital, Mark had faded into a semi-conscious state. The ER staff was ready for him, wheeling him into a treatment room with practiced efficiency. The paramedics gave their report detailing his symptoms, the intervention they had provided, and his response to treatment so far. The doctors and nurses took over immediately, working to determine whether the crisis had passed or if more serious actions needed to be taken. It wasn't until the paramedic was back in the ambulance, staring at the marks Karen had left behind, that he fully allowed himself to absorb what had happened. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face, and made a decision. He pulled out his phone and called his supervisor. "We've got an issue," he said, "and I want to report it." The next morning, when Mark finally woke up properly groggy but alive, he had no idea what had happened outside his house. He didn't know that Karen had damaged the ambulance, that she had insulted the paramedics in the middle of a life-threatening emergency, that she had made a fool of herself in a way that had left an entire crew of medical professionals shaking their heads in disbelief. He only knew that he was in a hospital bed, that there was an 4 in his arm, that his heart still beat in his chest. And then he saw the man sitting in the chair by the window, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Good morning," the paramedic said. Mark blinked, still foggy from the medication. "Do I know you?" The paramedic leaned forward slightly, watching him. "I was the one who helped get you here last night." Something about his tone sent a ripple of discomfort through Mark's chest. There was something more beneath those words, something unspoken, but strong. "You feeling okay?" the paramedic asked, his voice carefully neutral. Mark nodded slowly. "I think so." The paramedic nodded once, then sighed. "Good. Because we need to talk about your neighbor." At first, Mark didn't understand. His brain was still catching up, still piecing together the fragmented events of the night before. He remembered the pain, the panic, the sirens. But his neighbor? What did Karen have to do with anything? Then the paramedic took out his phone, scrolled through something, and turned the screen toward Mark. It was a photo. The ambulance, the scratches, the dented metal. And then another photo. Karen standing there, flashlight in hand, her face captured mid-motion as she struck the vehicle. The pieces clicked into place. Mark felt the surge of something dark and furious settle in his chest. "What the hell?" he muttered. The paramedic didn't say anything for a moment. Then finally he spoke. "We filed a police report," he said, "but I thought you should know first." Mark stared at him, his heart monitor beeping steadily in the background. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than exhaustion. He felt fury. Mark sat in the hospital bed staring at the paramedic's phone screen. The images of the vandalized ambulance burning into his mind. It took a moment for his brain to fully process what he was looking at: deep scratches along the vehicle's side, the cracked headlight, and Karen frozen in mid-motion as she struck the emergency vehicle with her flashlight. The anger that settled in his chest wasn't the quick, fiery kind that made a man lash out. Immediately, it was slow, burning, controlled. The kind that made his fingers tighten around the hospital sheets as he forced himself to take a steadying breath. He had spent years keeping his head down, avoiding unnecessary conflicts, maintaining a careful distance from the absurd disputes that seemed to consume other people's lives. But this wasn't some petty neighborhood disagreement about leaves in the yard or trash cans left out too long. This was different. The paramedic was watching him closely, his arms folded over his chest. "I figured you'd want to know before the police arrive," he said evenly. "They'll want to take your statement, considering it happened during your emergency response." Mark exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay level-headed. He had seen men destroy their own chances at justice by reacting too emotionally, by giving their opponents something to manipulate against them. Karen was exactly the type of person who would play the victim the moment it benefited her. If he rushed into the situation without thinking, she'd twist it into something absurd, make it seem like he was harassing her, and claim that she was a helpless old widow being unfairly targeted. No, if he was going to do this, he had to be strategic about it. "Thanks for letting me know," he said finally, his voice composed but firm. "I'll talk to the cops when they get here." The paramedic observed him for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Just be careful. People like her, they don't go down quietly." Mark didn't need to be told that by the time the police arrived at the hospital, Mark had already composed himself. The officer was a younger man, early 30s, with the look of someone who had already decided how seriously he was going to take this case. Before he even walked into the room, Mark could see it in his eyes, the mild indifference, the assumption that this was just another minor property conflict between neighbors. The officer introduced himself, took out his notepad, and started with the standard questions. Mark answered everything precisely, sticking to the facts, giving no room for misinterpretation or doubt. Yes, he had suffered a medical emergency. Yes, the ambulance had parked where it was necessary. No, Karen hadn't expressed any concern for his well-being, only for the inconvenience of having an emergency vehicle near her home. Yes, he had been unconscious when the vandalism occurred. Yes, he had been shown photographic proof of the damage. The officer nodded along, jotting down notes. But when Mark finished speaking, there was a long silence before he finally said, "We'll have to examine the situation before any charges can be filed." Mark narrowed his eyes slightly. "Examine?" The officer shrugged, shifting his weight. "Miss Willis has a different account of events. She claims the damage was already there before the ambulance arrived." A sharp chuckle escaped before Mark could stop it. "She hit the damn thing with a flashlight. There's a picture of her doing it." The officer nodded as if Mark had just told him the time of day. "Like I said, we'll investigate. If it turns out that she did in fact cause the damage, then proper measures will be taken." Mark could feel the irritation bubbling beneath his skin, but he forced himself to remain composed. He had seen this play out before. Officers not wanting to get involved in neighbor conflicts, brushing things off as minor incidents, trying to sweep things under the rug to avoid the paperwork. But this wasn't something that could be overlooked. He straightened slightly in the hospital bed, locking eyes with the officer. "I'll be requesting a copy of this report," he said evenly, "and I'll be following up on the progress of this investigation." The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Of course, sir. I'll make sure the necessary steps are taken." Mark didn't believe him. By the time he was discharged from the hospital the following afternoon, he had already made a choice. He wasn't going to sit back and wait for the police to delay action. He wasn't going to hope that Karen magically decided to do the right thing. He was going to ensure that there was no possible way for this to be dismissed. The first thing he did when he got home was check his security cameras, or at least he attempted to. When he pulled up the feed on his laptop, all he got was an error message. His brows furrowed as he checked the system records. The cameras had gone offline for 3 hours, the exact time frame during which the ambulance had arrived. His hands clenched in two fists. That wasn't a coincidence. Someone had interfered with them. His first thought was Karen. She was bold enough, reckless enough, petty enough. But as much as he wanted to believe she had done it, the technical aspect didn't fit. Karen was a problem, but she wasn't skilled. She didn't know how to disable a camera system without physically harming it, and his cameras were untouched, which meant someone else had done it. Mark felt a cold sense of unease settle in his stomach. This was no longer just about a damaged ambulance, he realized. He picked up his phone and called the company that managed his security system. After explaining the situation, the technician on the other end of the line promised to run a test remotely. The response came back within minutes. His system hadn't been breached remotely. It had been disabled from a physical access point. Someone had gotten close enough to disrupt it directly. Mark hung up the phone, his mind spinning. This was bigger than he imagined. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to think rationally. He needed to act wisely. If he confronted Karen now, she'd deny everything, and possibly try to escalate the situation further. If someone else had been involved, he needed to find out who, and most importantly, he needed to make sure he wasn't stepping into something even more dangerous than he had assumed. He made a second call to an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in a long time, but who he knew could assist. "Danny," he said when the other man picked up, "I need a favor." Danny Holt had worked in private security for years, specializing in surveillance and forensic evaluation. He wasn't a cop, but he was better in some ways. He actually cared about finding answers. "What's going on?" Danny asked. Mark exhaled slowly. "Someone cut my security feed during a medical emergency, and I have a strong suspicion my neighbor is involved." There was a pause on the other end before Danny finally said, "All right. Send me what you have. I'll take a look." Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over, and he wasn't going to let it go. Mark sat in his living room, his hands pressed together, fingers interlocked, as he stared at the blank screen of his laptop. The weight of everything that had happened in the past 48 hours settled heavily on his shoulders. His near-death experience was already enough to process, but what had transpired outside his home while he was struggling to stay alive was something else entirely. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about Karen's pettiness, nor was it about a simple case of property damage. Someone had deliberately shut down his security cameras at the exact moment the ambulance arrived. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. He checked his phone, waiting for a response from Danny. When it finally came in, he exhaled sharply before answering. "I ran a test on your security records," Danny said without delay. "You were right. The system wasn't breached remotely, and it wasn't a malfunction. Someone accessed your network manually from the outside." Mark clenched his jaw. How close would they have to be? Danny hesitated. "Within a few feet of your router," meaning they were either in your yard or right against the house. Mark's fingers clenched around the phone. He already knew that whoever had done this had to be someone nearby, someone familiar with his property, someone who had access to the right tools and the nerve to interfere with his system in the middle of a medical crisis. Danny continued, his voice lower. "Now, Mark, this isn't just some amateur move. This is someone who knew what they were doing. It wasn't just about shutting off your cameras. It was about managing the situation, making sure that whatever happened outside your house couldn't be linked back to them." Mark ran a hand down his face. "Karen? I don't think so," Danny said, surprising him. "I mean, yeah, she's clearly a problem. But from what you've told me, she's loud and arrogant, not technically skilled." Cutting a security feed like this isn't something she could manage on her own. Someone assisted her. Mark felt the unease settle deeper. You think she's working with someone? I think she either got support or someone has a strong reason to keep you in the dark. Mark thought about that. Karen was manipulative, but she wasn't clever. She was the type to throw a tantrum over a parked vehicle, to damage a vehicle in a fit of rage, but not the type to execute a calculated move like this. So who the hell had done it? Danny sighed on the other end. I'm going to run some deeper checks. In the meantime, you need to handle this carefully. Don't alert her. If she's in over her head, she might panic and do something reckless. Mark nodded to himself. Yeah, all right. He hung up and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His mind was spinning now, trying to put together the timeline, the intentions, the connections. Someone had taken the effort to deactivate his security. But why? Was it just to make sure Karen's vandalism wasn't caught on tape? Or was it something bigger? The answer came sooner than he expected that evening, as he sat in his kitchen sipping a cup of coffee and considering his next move. There was a sharp knock at the door. He set down the mug, his pulse already increasing. He wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, he walked to the door, glancing through the peephole. Karen. His jaw clenched, but he forced himself to take a steadying breath before unlocking the door and opening it just enough to see her. She stood there with a forced smile, her posture rigid, as if she were practicing something in her mind. Mark, she said, her voice artificially sweet. I heard you were back from the hospital. I just wanted to check in, see how you were doing. Mark stared at her. Was she serious? He didn't respond immediately, just let the silence stretch between them. Karen's smile faded slightly, but she quickly regained it. You know, I was so concerned when I saw the ambulance, she continued. I had no idea what was happening. I hope everything's all right. Mark kept his expression unreadable. She was testing the situation, trying to measure how much he knew. You were concerned? He asked, his voice flat. Of course, she said quickly, we're neighbors, after all. And well, you know how much I care about this neighborhood. Mark almost laughed at the boldness of it. She cared about the neighborhood. She had been more worried about a parked ambulance than a dying man. Instead of calling her out directly, he played along. That's good to know, he said, because the police came by earlier to discuss the damage done to the ambulance. They're investigating it now. Karen's expression shifted just for a second, but it was enough. Her eyes flickered slightly to the side before she forced her face back into a mask of concern. Oh, that's horrible, she said, pretending to be unaware. Vandalism is such a terrible thing. I hope they catch whoever did it. Mark leaned against the door frame, observing her carefully. They will, he said. There's proof. Clear, undeniable proof. Karen's throat moved slightly as she swallowed. Well, she said after a pause, I just wanted to check in. Let me know if you need anything. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked quickly back to her house. Mark shut the door, locking it behind him. She was shaken, that much was obvious. But was it because she was guilty? Or was there more to it? And why the hell had someone disabled his security? The answers came the next morning. Danny called him, his tone serious. Mark, you need to hear this. Mark sat up straighter. What did you find? I checked the logs again, and I found something buried in the system. Whoever disabled your cameras didn't just shut them down. They rerouted them. For 3 hours, your feed wasn't offline. It was redirected to another server. Mark's stomach tightened. You mean someone was watching? Danny hesitated. Not just watching, recording. Mark exhaled sharply, trying to process what that meant. Someone had taken control of his security cameras, making sure that instead of recording what happened outside his house, the footage was being stored somewhere else. But why? Who needed that footage? And then it hit him. What if the cameras weren't disabled to hide Karen? He said slowly. What if they were disabled to observe something else? Danny was silent for a moment. Then that's what I'm concerned about. Mark's mind raced. Someone had planned this. The question was, what were they searching for? And why was Karen suddenly so anxious? He wasn't sure yet, but he was damn sure going to find out. Mark had always considered himself a practical man, someone who relied on reasoning and careful thinking rather than impulsive reactions. But as he sat at his kitchen table, his fingers tapping against the wood in a slow, deliberate rhythm, he couldn't ignore the simmering frustration building in his chest. The more pieces of this puzzle he put together, the more it became clear that this wasn't just a case of an arrogant neighbor throwing a tantrum. Someone had hijacked his security system. Someone had rerouted his camera feed. Someone had been observing. And Karen, who had always been the queen of petty grievances, was now acting uneasy, defensive, as if she knew more than she was admitting. Danny's discovery had changed everything. Before, Mark had been focused on dealing with Karen's blatant vandalism, ensuring that she was held responsible for her actions. But now, the situation had taken on an entirely different significance. Whoever had tampered with his system hadn't done it just to cover for Karen. That much was clear. No, this was bigger. Someone had been collecting information. Someone had been trying to see something. Or someone. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose as he forced himself to analyze. His first instinct was to go back over every interaction he'd had with Karen in the past few months, searching for anything that might suggest what she could be concealing. She was controlling, territorial, obsessed with maintaining power over their neighborhood. But she wasn't careful. She liked being noticed. She liked people knowing she was the one in charge. And yet, for the first time since he had known her, she had withdrawn. She had come to his door, all false concern and forced politeness, pretending she cared about his well-being. But what if she hadn't come just to check on him? What if she had been trying to measure his awareness? What if she had been trying to see if he had figured out what was actually happening? Mark wasn't going to wait for her to make another move. If she was nervous, then he needed to push her further. The next morning, he took a slow walk down their street, acting as if he were simply stretching his legs, getting fresh air, shaking off the lingering effects of his hospital stay. He nodded at a few neighbors, noticing how some of them avoided his gaze, how others seemed to watch him for just a second too long before looking away. Word had gotten around. Karen had told her version of events, no doubt, spinning the story to make herself seem like the victim. That was fine. Mark wasn't interested in fighting a battle of gossip. He was interested in answers. As he neared Karen's house, he slowed his pace, scanning the property. Her blinds were partially drawn, but he could see the faint movement of a shadow inside. She was watching him. Good. Without hesitation, he stepped off the sidewalk and onto her driveway, walking straight up to her front door. He knocked twice, then took a step back, crossing his arms as he waited a long pause. Then finally, the door opened just enough for Karen to peer out, her expression carefully composed. "Mark," she said, her voice overly casual, "did you need something?" He didn't smile, didn't play along. "Yeah, actually," he said, "I wanted to talk about my security cameras." Her fingers twitched slightly against the doorframe. "Oh, what about them?" Mark tilted his head slightly, observing her reaction. "They were disabled the night I was taken to the hospital. Not just turned off, rerouted. Someone was recording from a different location." Karen's face barely changed, but there was a flicker in her eyes, a tightness around her mouth. "That sounds troubling." "It is," Mark agreed, "especially since it happened at the exact moment the ambulance arrived." Silence stretched between them. Karen held her ground, but Mark could see the strain in her posture, the way her weight had shifted slightly, as if preparing to retreat. "If you know something," he said, his voice calm but firm, "now's the time to tell me." Karen let out a short, forced chuckle. "Mark, I don't have the slightest idea what you're talking about. You always assume the worst of me, but this, it's paranoid." Mark didn't blink. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe you're just a terrible liar." Karen's jaw tightened. "If you're going to accuse me of something, I suggest you bring proof." Mark took a slow step closer, lowering his voice just enough that she had to strain to hear him. "You really think the people who did this won't turn on you the second they realize I'm getting too close?" For the first time, Karen's mask cracked just slightly, just enough. Mark didn't push further. He had planted the thought. Now, he just had to wait. That night, his patience paid off. At exactly 2:47 a.m., The motion sensors on his remaining security cameras triggered an alert. Mark, who had been lying awake in bed, sat up immediately, grabbing his phone to check the live feed. The screen showed a grainy black and white image of Karen standing at the edge of her property, looking up and down the street. She was dressed in dark clothing, her usual robe and slippers replaced with something more concealed. She was uneasy. Mark watched as she hesitated, then quickly moved toward the side of her house, disappearing from view. He switched cameras, tracking her movement. She wasn't going inside. She was heading toward her backyard. Mark's pulse quickened as he watched her approach a wooden fence, the one that separated her property from the narrow alley behind the row of houses. And then, just as she reached the fence, just as she moved to push it open, a figure emerged from the shadows. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The man was tall, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the low resolution of the camera. He moved with purpose, stepping toward Karen as she hesitated, as if she had been expecting him, but was still unsettled. They exchanged words, too quiet for Mark to hear, but the body language was clear. Karen was nervous. The man was in control. Then, without warning, the man grabbed her arm. Karen flinched, yanking herself free, shaking her head as if rejecting whatever he had just said. The man stood still for a moment, then took a step closer. Karen stumbled back. Mark's jaw tightened. He didn't know who the man was, but he knew one thing for certain. Karen wasn't calling the shots anymore. She had been pulled into something bigger than she could manage. And now, whether she liked it or not, she wasn't the one making the decisions. Mark watched as the man finally let her go. As Karen rushed back toward her house, as the figure remained for a moment before vanishing into the alley, he exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Karen had always been a problem, but now she was a weak link. And someone out there didn't like weak links. Mark didn't sleep after what he had seen. He sat in his living room, his phone resting on the table, the video feed frozen on the frame of Karen stumbling back from the man in the alley. He had replayed it over and over, examining every movement, every hesitation, every detail that might give him a clue about what the hell was really happening. The way she recoiled when the men grabbed her, the way he towered over her, the barely contained hostility in his posture. It was all so far removed from the image Karen presented to the world. She had always been the one in charge, the one who set the rules, the one who made others feel insignificant. But now she had looked terrified. That meant something. That meant an opportunity. At 7:00 a.m., Mark stepped outside, his coffee in hand, his body drained, but his mind sharper than ever. The neighborhood was silent, the early morning air still and crisp. He glanced over at Karen's house, half expecting to see her peering through the blinds, like she always did. But there was nothing. No sign of her. That wasn't normal. Mark crossed the street and knocked on her door. He wasn't sure what he expected. Another forced smile. Another attempt at pretending she wasn't unraveling. But when the door finally opened, Karen didn't even try to hide it. She looked terrible. Her usually flawless hair was a mess. Dark circles sat under her eyes, and her skin had taken on a pale, almost sickly shade. For the first time in all the years he had known her, she looked truly shaken. "Mark," she said, her voice strained. He observed her carefully. "Rough night?" Karen didn't respond right away. She glanced past him, scanning the street as if ensuring they weren't being watched. Then, with a sharp inhale, she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in." That was unexpected. Mark hesitated, but only for a second. Then he stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him. Karen didn't waste time with small talk. She walked straight into the kitchen, rubbing her hands over her face before leaning against the counter. For a moment, she just stood there, her fingers gripping the edge of the marble like she needed to steady herself. Then she exhaled. "They're watching me," she said softly. Mark didn't respond. Immediately, he just let the words linger between them. "Who?" he asked finally. Karen let out a bitter laugh. "Does it matter?" Mark tilted his head slightly. "It does to me." Karen closed her eyes for a second before looking at him again. There was something different in her stare now. Not just fear, but surrender. She knew she had trapped herself. "It started with small things," she said. "A favor here, a connection there. Nothing illegal, nothing major, just helping things move along. Mark didn't interrupt. He let her continue. Then it got worse. Documents needed to vanish. People needed to be forced into selling their homes. And I allowed it because I thought I was still in charge. She let out a shaky breath, her hands gripping the counter. But I never. Was Mark already knew that? Who's the guy from last night? He asked. Karen flinched at the mention of it. You saw? I saw. She swallowed hard, her fingers twitching slightly. I don't know his name. He doesn't use one. But I know what he does. If someone stops being useful, if someone talks too much, she exhaled sharply, they disappear. Mark felt the weight of her words sink in his chest. This wasn't just corruption. This wasn't just some petty misuse of power. This was something far worse. So why are you still here? He asked. Karen's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Because I don't have a choice. She looked at him, then really looked at him, and for the first time Mark saw something in her that almost resembled remorse. You should leave this alone, Mark, she said. I mean it. But Mark had never been the kind of man who could walk away from something like this. He stepped forward, his voice steady. No, I don't think I will. Karen exhaled, shaking her head. Then you'd better be ready for what happens next. Mark didn't respond. He just turned and walked out the door. As he stepped back into the morning light, he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Mark didn't go back inside his house right away. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, staring down the quiet, sunlit street, letting the weight of the morning settle in his chest. He had walked into Karen's house expecting to get under her skin, to push her into making a mistake, to force her to reveal something he could use against her. But what he had found instead was a woman who was already trapped, barely keeping herself afloat, in something much deeper and darker than he had expected. He should have felt satisfied, maybe even justified, after all the misery she had put him through. But instead, he felt something closer to unease. Karen was afraid, and fear made people unpredictable. He walked back to his house, his steps slower than before. His mind was already working through the possibilities, trying to piece together the timeline of what had really been happening in this neighborhood. Karen had admitted to concealing documents, to pressuring people into selling their homes. But for who? Who was influential enough to make her someone who thrived on control, submit to their authority? He didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to wait for them to come to him. He picked up his phone and called Danny. I need you to pull records on property transfers in this area over the last 5 years, Mark said without introduction. When Danny answered, there was a brief silence, then Danny sighed. You really don't know how to let things go, do you? Mark didn't answer. Danny exhaled through his nose. Fine, I'll check, but if I find something, you'd better be prepared to deal with it. Mark didn't say it out loud, but he already was. By the time the sun had set, Danny had sent him a file, dozens of names, dates, and transaction histories. Mark scrolled through them, his eyes scanning for patterns. And then he found it. Nearly a dozen homes, all sold under questionable circumstances, all bought by shell companies that traced back to a single investment group. And at the center of it all, buried beneath layers of paperwork and fake identities, was a name he recognized: Elliot Grayson. The same Elliot Grayson who had been quietly buying up commercial property on the edges of town. The same Elliot Grayson who had been pushing new zoning laws to convert residential areas into mixed-use developments. The same Elliot Grayson who 10 years ago had been under federal investigation for fraud before the case had mysteriously vanished. Mark leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. It wasn't just Karen, it never had been. She was just another piece in the game. The next morning, he was up early watching Karen's house from his window. She hadn't left since their conversation. No car in the driveway, no movement behind the curtains, just silence. And then, just after 9 o'clock, a black SUV pulled up. Mark's pulse quickened as he watched a man step out, tall, well-dressed, the kind of expensive haircut that signaled wealth and power. Even from a distance, Mark could tell this wasn't just some errand boy, this was someone who gave orders. Karen answered the door almost immediately, and the man stepped inside without hesitation. Mark didn't hesitate either. He grabbed his keys and walked out. heading straight for the only place where he knew he could set all of this in motion. The police station. Walking through those doors, he expected resistance. He expected the same lack of concern he had been met with before, but this time he wasn't coming in with a vandalism complaint. He was coming in with documents, with names, with links that the department couldn't afford to dismiss. It took over an hour talking, explaining, laying everything out in clear detail. He knew they wouldn't act immediately. Bureaucracy moved slowly. But when he left that building, he knew he had planted something that couldn't be overlooked. By the time he got home, the SUV was gone, but Karen's door was open, and that unease in his chest turned into something colder. Mark approached, carefully, stepping inside. The house was silent, vacant, and on the kitchen counter there was a single envelope with his name on it. He picked it up, opening it cautiously. Inside was a handwritten note. "I told you to. Leave it alone now. I don't have a choice." Mark's grip tightened on the paper. Karen was gone. Whether she had left on her own or had been taken, he didn't know, but he knew what this meant. It meant he was next,